The Betrayer. Despite the interference from the warp, astropathic reports continued to trickle into the Cadian High Command. The most disturbing of these was transmission from a planetary defense force major upon the world of Tabor, whose brutal accounts of the events afflicting his garrison made for gruesome reading. If the report was to be believed, none other than Karn of the World Eater's Traitor Legion, the so-called Betrayer, had fallen upon that doomed world and shed the blood of its brave defenders in the name of his unspeakable patron, Khorne. The Blood God, despite the arrival of this fiend, Imperial forces had made gains upon Tabor and across the Agrippina sector. If the Imperial defenders could somehow contain Karn's mad rampage, the strategic situation in that region would be, at the very least, somewhat more acceptable. Pursuit of the Voice. During the campaigns of the 13th Black Crusade, the Dark Angels and Space Wolves' ancient mutual rivalry caused severe disruptions to Imperial defensive efforts in the Sentinel Worlds area. Though both forces operated in the same region for several solar weeks, they refused to coordinate their actions, harming the ability of the Imperial Guard commanders on the ground to act, for they could not rely upon the aid of either chapter. The situation soon changed as the Dark Angels, abruptly left the area in search of renegade individuals they refused to identify. The Dark Angels sought the shadowy heretic, calling himself the Voice of the Emperor, who was operating on the world of Leitar. The Dark Angels launched a number of strikes against this figure, but on each occasion found that the pressure of constant attacks upon their hallowed ground in the Caliban system forced them to redeploy their forces. Each time the Dark Angels managed to close on the suspected location of the Voice, he somehow proved able to slip through their clutches, leaving behind taunting, heretical graffiti. The Voice transmitted a number of all-channel voxcasts throughout the war, making obscure references to the First Legion's earliest history, as well as making astonishing claims against their Primarch Lionel Johnson. The Dark Angels and the Unforgiven successor chapters vehemently rebuted these blasphemous broadcasts. The Dark Angels and the chapters of the Unforgiven relentlessly pursued this heretic and his followers and eventually captured him. But as the Voice lay languishing within the holds of one of their vessels, he somehow, through some as yet unidentified means, managed to effect his escape. The Green Crusade. This is going to be about orcs, isn't it? With the forces of chaos overwhelming every Imperial world within the vicinity of the Eye of Terror, a large force of orcs took advantage of the state of anarchy threatening many star systems and launched an all-out attack upon the worlds of Scarus Sector. The so-called Green Crusade was remarkably well coordinated for an orc invasion, and soon succeeded in grinding down the defenses of several Imperial worlds, notably Lete 9 or 11. The Black Templars chapter diverted a number of fighting companies to oppose them, lest they gather into a fully fledged war. The Battle of Kasr Holm. The forces of chaos continued to hit Imperial forces hard across the entire region surrounding the Eye of Terror. The fortress world of Kasr Holm, one of the outer planets of the Cadia system, had borne the brunt of the chaotic ground assault on Cadia over a number of solar days, with wave after wave of frenzied mutants assaulting the walls of the fortress world's capital city. 15 regiments of Cadian shock troops manned the defenses there, and an entire legion of the Adeptus Titanicus was deployed. Were it only the seemingly endless hordes of ill-disciplined mutants attacking Kasr Holm's capital, the Imperial defenders might have been able to contain them there. But the assaults were led by none other than the traitor Astartes of the Black Legion. The Black Legion were content to allow the thousands of mutants to crash against the Kasr Holm's capital's defenses in order to wear down and deplete their material stores through sheer attrition. Each wave had repulsed, but only at the cost of many brave defenders. and with little or no effect on the arch-enemy's forces' numbers. Just when the attackers were sent once more into an undisciplined rout, the Black Legionnaires launched their own attack. These attacks cost the Imperial defenders dear, though unfortunately they were unable to pierce the defenders' lines. Yet with each successive wave, they were only able to kill a handful of the enemy, while the casualties of the defenders sustained were intolerantly high. Lord Castellan Creed moved his headquarters from Cadia to Castellanholm to counter the crisis rapidly developing there, believing that his inspiring presence would make the same difference as the addition of several regiments. He led a bold counterattack at the head of the Cadian 8th Regiment, the Lord Castellan's own, against the forces of chaos, slaying forth with the Imperial force once the latest wave of mutants had receded, and struck at the Black Legion before the Chaos Space Marines' own assaults could develop. The Imperial counterattack was a resounding success, and as Creed returned to the walls of Castellanholm's capital at the head of the 8th Cadian, the entire length of the eastern wall erupted into the cheers of many thousands of men. But soon the Battle of Castellanholm took a new and an unanticipated turn, one that could scarcely be believed had it not been witnessed personally. At the height of the next assault of the mutants upon the eastern wall of Castellanholm's capital cities, primarily the fortress, at the moment when it appeared as if the Black Legion would force a breach, the feral 13th Company of Space Wolves appeared from behind the traitors' lines and inflicting a crushing defeat upon them. Both the Chaos attackers and the Imperial defenders heard with their own ears the animalistic howls emitted by these barbarous warriors, even though many were at their station some distance from the fighting. The sound chilled everyone who heard it to the core. Fortunately, the effect upon the enemy was greater still. The vile mutants fled first, turning their backs and fleeing in an instant. Their Black Legion masters attempted to forestall the rout, firing upon the mutants in an effort to render them more terrified of their own master's retribution than they were of the 13th Company. But their efforts were wasted, and many Black Legionnaires were trampled as the mutants stampeded from the walls. Soon the Black Legionnaires were themselves assaulted, and those not cut down from the rear were forced to quit the field, an event unheard of to date for the fierce Chaos Space Marines of Abbadon's own traitor legion. The 13th Company's attack was over almost as soon as it had begun, and they soon withdrew, making no attempts to communicate with the other Imperial forces as they did so. Imperium Resurgent. With so many sectors of the Segmentum Obscurus now cut off from Imperial reinforcements by the actions of the forces of chaos, the war had escalated by a degree of magnitude in those areas still accessible to both sides. The fighting in such regions as the Cadian Scarus and Agrippina sector had reached an unprecedented level, with millions throwing themselves upon the crucible of utter and total war to save the Cadian Gate from falling irrecoverably into the clutches of the ruinous powers. In an amazing twist of fate, the Imperial reinforcements from Battlefleet Solar arrived many solar weeks earlier than expected. For the tides of the warp have never been predictable. The lost 13th Company of the Space Wolves added their feral might to the battle for the chaos-infested capital city of Castellanholm, and the mighty vessel of Durk Lurstafon, at the head of the Imperial Navy's battle group Rorak, braved the warp storm to bring aid to the besieged Cadian system. Under the bruised and crackling skies of his homeworld, Creed, the Lord Castellan of Cadia, had launched a major counter-assault against the forces of chaos infesting the fortress world, while the Weiskar's chapter engaged the troops of the arch-enemy across the Cadian sector. Not a single man was spared, and the death toll spiraled ever upward. Space Marine Crusade. After many long solar weeks of beleaguered stubborn resistance, the defenders of the Cadian Gate were finally reinforced by the combined forces of dozens of Space Marine chapters. This Imperial Crusade had been gathered from the most distant regions of the galaxy, answering the call to arms issued with the forces of Abbadon issued when the forces of Abbadon had first commenced their invasion. The Space Marine Crusade was greeted with adulation and joy by the battered and bloody defenders of the Cadian Gate. The Space Marines who had fought at the gate since the beginning of the conflict were now joined by their brethren, and all stood ready to take the fight to the arch enemy with the courage and conviction that only Space Marines could display. The simmering rivalries between the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels stationed in the Sentinel world were eclipsed by the alleged fallen angel sighting near the ruins of Caliban, and the rumors of an artifact of the Primarch Leman Rus that was held on the world of the Nemesis Tessera. The Blood Angels, after their arrival at Castle Partox on Cadia, prepare for the assault of the largest horde of World Eaters seen in living memory. Typhus, the Herald of Nurgle, took a personal hand in the battle for the world of Makaria, teleporting in and slaughtering platoon after platoon of Cadian guardsmen before returning to his flagship. His gift of fear inflicted the Cadians' ranks even quicker than the plagues he spread by his mere presence. Having re-established contact with the other chapter masters fighting in the region, Logan Grimnar, the commander of the Adeptus Astartes Command Council for the campaign, dictated that all Astartes' efforts should be focused on the defense of Cadian, Bellis Corona, and Agrippina sectors of the Segmento. Now the contact had been made with those chapters newly arrived in the Segmento. A coordinated attack could be launched that was set to sweep away the invaders in one fell swoop. Many within the Cadian High Command prayed that two of the greatest Astartes chapters to serve the Imperium, the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves, would set aside their interest in disagreement for long enough for their efforts to bear fruit. With so many Space Marines now bolstering the Imperial defense, the forces of the Traitor Legions had not been idle. The Chaos Rear Guard joined the fray, engaging the Space Marines in every theater of war. Those traitors who had turned up their master and their kin 10 millennia past were consumed with hatred for their erstwhile battle brothers, and threw themselves at the new arrivals with wanton bloodlust. With such legendary warriors as the Blood Angels, the Black Templars, the Imperial Fists, the Howling Griffins, and the White Scars, and the many more now defending Imperial space from Abbadon's invasion, the Imperium at long last possessed a real chance to successfully turn back the 13th Black Crusade.